November 1951. The temperature outside had already dropped to 14 below zero, and Cole Brannan had exactly $10 left to his name. No house, no family willing to take him in, no plan. Just a frozen dirt road, a canvas bag, and a rusted metal shell sitting abandoned at the edge of somebody else's land. A surplus military Quonset hut that most men wouldn't have given a second glance. Most men would have kept walking. Cole didn't. What happened inside that curved iron shell over the next 11 weeks would leave the entire county speechless, because the same structure they called a junkyard eyesore, the same hut neighbors laughed at when they drove past, became the only warm building standing when the worst blizzard in a generation buried everything else under 6 feet of ice and silence. But here's the part nobody talks about. Cole didn't survive that winter because he was lucky. He survived because of something he did in the first 48 hours. Something so simple, most people would have never thought to do it. And by the time spring arrived, the men who laughed were the ones knocking on his door. If this is your first time here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us, what would you have done with your last $10 in a frozen field? We read every single one. Now let's get into it. November 4th, 1951. The kind of cold that didn't just chill your skin, it reached inside your chest and squeezed. Cole Brannan walked the last mile of a dirt road outside Harlan County, Nebraska, with nothing but a canvas bag on his shoulder, a pair of boots that had started separating at the left sole, and $10 folded into the breast pocket of a coat that was never designed for weather like this. He wasn't a drifter by nature. 3 months ago, he had a roof, a job at a grain elevator, and a room he rented from a man named Douglas Phelps, who had always seemed reasonable enough, until the day he didn't. A dispute over unpaid overtime, a week of tension that nobody addressed, and then one morning Cole arrived at work to find his things packed into that same canvas bag and left beside the road like they were somebody's trash. No warning, no conversation, just a locked door and a note that said the room had been rented to someone else. Cole had spent the following weeks moving between towns, taking whatever short work appeared, hauling feed, mending fences, splitting wood for a hardware man in Ainsworth who paid him $3 in a meal and then had no more use for him. By the time October passed into November, the money had thinned down to almost nothing. The temperatures had begun their serious descent, and Cole understood something with the quiet clarity of a man who has run out of options. Winter in Nebraska was not a season you negotiated with. It arrived with the full weight of the northern plains behind it, and it did not care what your circumstances were. People died out here. Not dramatically, not in ways that made newspapers. They simply got cold, then colder, and then they stopped. Cole was 26 years old, and he had no intention of becoming one of those quiet statistics. But intention and circumstance, as he had recently learned, did not always cooperate. It was a farmer named Walt Gruder who first mentioned the Quonset hut, not as a suggestion, not as an act of kindness, but almost as an afterthought, while Cole was helping him stack hay bales for $1.50 and a cup of coffee. Walt mentioned that an old military surplus hut had been sitting on the far edge of his east field for going on 4 years, left there by a neighbor who had bought it with some idea about grain storage and then abandoned the whole plan when the costs ran longer than the ambition. Nobody owned it in any practical sense. Nobody used it. The neighbor had moved his family to Omaha and hadn't set foot on that land since. Walt said all of this while looking at the horizon rather than at Cole, the way men in that part of the country sometimes communicated things they weren't quite offering, but weren't quite withholding either. Cole finished stacking the hay, collected his $1.50, and didn't say anything more about it, but he didn't forget it either. He found the hut just before dusk. It sat in the open field like something dropped from the sky and never collected. A half-cylinder of corrugated steel, maybe 16 feet wide and 30 feet long, the military olive paint long since surrendered to rust and weather. One end had a wooden wall with a door frame, but no actual door, just a rectangle open to the wind. The floor inside was frozen earth. Old leaves had blown in and compacted against the far wall. A crack ran along the upper seam on the north side where two panels hadn't been bolted properly, and through it came a thin, steady whistle of air that sounded almost like something alive and unhappy. Cole stood in the entrance for a long moment. The temperature was already dropping towards single digits, and the sky had taken on that particular flat gray color that meant serious weather was building somewhere to the northwest. Most men, standing in that doorway, would have felt their stomachs sink. Cole felt something different move through him, something quieter and more deliberate than hope, something closer to calculation. He had $10. That was the full picture. In 1951, $10 in a rural Nebraska town could buy you a modest collection of things if you were careful, or it could buy you one or two things if you weren't. Cole sat down on the frozen floor of that Quonset hut with his back against the curved steel wall and did something that most people in a crisis never think to do. He didn't panic. He didn't start walking toward the nearest town. He pulled a short pencil from his coat pocket and a scrap of paper from the canvas bag, and he started writing down every problem in front of him, in order of which one would kill him first. No door meant wind. Wind meant heat loss faster than any fire could replace it. The crack in the seam meant the same. The floor was frozen earth, which would pull warmth directly out of any body lying on it throughout the night. These were not abstract concerns. These were a sequence of problems, and sequences, Cole had learned from his father years ago, could be addressed one step at a time if you didn't make the mistake of trying to solve all of them at once. The next morning, Cole was in town before the hardware store opened. He spent $2.20 on a roll of heavy canvas tarpaulin material, 60 cents on a box of roofing nails, and another $1.40 on a bundle of cheap fiberglass insulation scraps the owner was selling loose from a damaged shipment. He bought a small can of wood stove sealant for 80 cents and spent the remaining coins on 2 candles and a box of matches. People in the store noticed him. That was unavoidable in a town of that size. A young man with a worn coat and a canvas bag buying an unusual combination of materials on a bitter November morning attracted the kind of quiet attention that small towns were built for. The hardware owner, a heavy-set man named Gerald Ferris, asked without much warmth where Cole was staying. Cole told him he had found a place east of town. Gerald looked at the materials on the counter and then looked at Cole and didn't ask anything further. But the expression on his face said enough. It said what most people in Harlan County would say openly over the following weeks, that whatever this young man was attempting out in that frozen field, it wasn't going to work. Winter in Nebraska had a way of correcting people who thought they were smarter than the cold. Cole carried everything back to the hut in 2 trips, moving fast to stay warm, his breath coming out in short, visible clouds above the frozen ground. He worked through the afternoon without stopping, without a fire, fingers going numb inside his gloves every 20 minutes before he tucked them under his arms to recover feeling and started again. By the time the light began to fail, the door frame had a canvas panel nailed tight across it, with the tarpaulin doubled over itself for thickness. The seam crack had been packed with insulation scraps and sealed along the edges with the wood stove compound. It wasn't finished, not even close to finished. But when Cole finally allowed himself to stop and stand quietly in the interior of that Quonset hut and simply listen, the whistle of wind through the northern seam was gone. The rectangle of open sky that had been the doorway was gone. The hut was still brutally cold, but for the first time, it was cold on his terms rather than Winter's. He didn't know yet what was gathering in the atmosphere 200 miles to the northwest. He didn't know that Walt Gruder's barometer had dropped 3 points that afternoon, or that the old farmers around Harlan County were already looking at the sky with the particular expression men wore when they recognized something they had seen before and didn't enjoy remembering. Cole simply laid down his tools, pulled his coat tighter, and looked up at the curved steel ceiling above him in the growing dark. What he was about to build inside this hut would either carry him through the winter or it wouldn't. But there was something else he hadn't accounted for yet, something hidden inside the walls of this abandoned structure that was about to change the entire equation. The thing Cole found wasn't valuable in any way most people would recognize. No silver coins beneath a flagstone, no hidden cache of supplies left by some forgotten stranger. What he found, tucked behind a loose panel near the base of the curved wall on the south side, was a folded piece of oilskin wrapped around a small stack of papers. He pulled it out carefully, carried it toward the canvas door where the last gray light of the afternoon was still usable, and unfolded it. The papers turned out to be a handwritten maintenance log, military issue, the kind that soldiers filled out on equipment and structures during the war years. Whoever had been responsible for this particular hut during its service life had been unusually thorough. Page after page of observations, temperature readings taken at different times of day, notes on where condensation collected and why, sketches showing airflow patterns inside the curved interior during different wind directions. And near the back, several pages that weren't official at all, personal notes written in a different hand, smaller and more careful, from someone who had clearly spent a significant amount of time thinking about how to make a Quonset hut livable in extreme cold rather than simply functional. Cole read every page twice before the light failed completely. Then he sat in the dark and thought about what he had just been handed. The name signed at the bottom of those personal pages was Corporal E. Maddox, and whatever posting had put Corporal Maddox inside a Quonset hut in genuinely brutal conditions, Alaska, the Aleutians, somewhere north and unforgiving, the man had clearly decided that surviving it required more than standard military procedure. His notes described 3 problems with Quonset hut heating that nobody in the official documentation ever addressed. The first was radiant cold from the curved steel walls themselves, which pulled warmth away from any heat source faster than the source could replace it. The second was floor temperature. Frozen ground, Maddox wrote, was not simply cold, it was actively hostile, and any heat you generated would be consumed by it before it reached the air you were breathing. The third problem was the one most people never thought about until it was too late. Moisture. A heated interior created condensation on cold metal walls. That condensation froze. The ice acted as a conductor, accelerating heat loss along the entire surface. You could have a roaring fire inside a Quonset hut and still freeze to death if you hadn't addressed the walls and the floor first. Cole read that last part again slowly. Then he understood why every conventional instinct about surviving in a metal shelter was not just incomplete, it was backwards. He was back in town the following morning, before most people had finished their breakfast. He had no money left after the first supply run, which meant the next part of what Maddox's notes described required a different approach entirely. Cole spent the morning working the problem the way his father had taught him to work every problem, by identifying what he needed and then finding the honest version of how to get it. He stopped at Walt Gruder's farm first and offered 2 days of fence repair work in exchange for a stack of old hay bales Walt had sitting in a deteriorating corner of the barn, too compressed and weathered for proper feed use, but still dry at the center. Walt looked at him for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man deciding how much curiosity was appropriate, and then agreed without asking what the hay was for. Cole then walked to a small salvage yard on the south edge of town, operated by a quiet man named Herb Casson, and asked whether he had any scrap lumber, ends, broken planks, anything that wasn't worth selling. Herb had a pile behind the main building that had been collecting for 2 years. Cole could take what he could carry for nothing, Herb said, if he moved it himself and cleaned up the area around it. Cole made 3 trips. By the afternoon of the second day, the interior of the Quonset hut looked almost unrecognizable from what it had been 48 hours earlier. The hay bales were stacked too deep along the curved interior walls, from floor to halfway up the arch, creating a barrier between the steel and the living space that Maddox's notes described as the single most important modification a man could make to a metal shelter in winter conditions. The thermal difference was immediate and almost startling. The air inside still carried cold, but the particular aggressive edge of it, that radiating, penetrating chill that came directly off the metal, was gone. The scrap lumber had gone into a raised platform along the center of the floor. Nothing elaborate, just a framework that lifted the sleeping and living area 8 inches above the frozen ground. Cole packed the gaps beneath it with more hay. The floor still bled cold upward, but the platform interrupted it, gave the air a chance to warm slightly before it reached anything living. Cole stood in the middle of what he had built, looked around at the hay-lined walls and the rough wooden platform and the canvas door holding firm against an afternoon wind that had been trying to undo it for 2 days, and allowed himself one quiet moment of something close to satisfaction. Then he went back to work, because satisfaction, in November in Nebraska, was a feeling you earned after winter, not before it. The town had noticed his coming and going by now, and in the way of small communities everywhere, it had already reached its conclusions. Gerald Ferris at the hardware store had mentioned the unusual supply purchase to enough people that the general outline of what Cole was doing out in Walt Gruder's East Field had circulated through Harlan County within days. The reaction split along predictable lines. A few people, mostly older farmers who had survived their own versions of desperate winters, said nothing, and watched with the careful neutrality of people who knew better than to judge a method before it was tested. But the majority opinion, the one that traveled faster and landed harder, was something between amusement and mild concern. A young man with no money, no family connections, and no particular standing in the community had moved himself into an abandoned military surplus hut in a frozen field, and was apparently attempting to winter there. Some people found it sad, others found it faintly ridiculous. A rancher named Douglas Holt told 3 people at the feed store that Cole Brannan was going to be a cautionary tale by January, and that someone ought to find the boy a proper situation before the county had a problem on its hands. Nobody disagreed loudly enough to matter. Cole heard versions of this. Small towns had a way of ensuring that the person being discussed eventually received an edited summary of the discussion, and enough people looked at him with a particular combination of pity and uncomfortable curiosity that the message was clear without anyone having to state it directly. What surprised him was how little it affected him. Not because he was indifferent to what people thought, but because the cold was a more honest critic than any of them. Every morning he woke up on that wooden platform and ran his hand along the hay-lined wall nearest his head and checked whether the temperature inside was holding. Every evening he made a note in the back pages of Maddox's log, his own entries now appearing beneath the corporal's, a continuation of an observation record started by a stranger in a different frozen place a decade earlier. The numbers were telling him something that the town's opinion was not. The system was working. Slowly, imperfectly, with problems still unsolved and vulnerabilities he hadn't fully addressed, but working. And that gap between what the numbers showed and what the town believed was the thing Cole turned over in his mind during the long, quiet evenings before sleep. He wasn't angry about it. He was something more useful than angry. He was paying attention. There was still one problem. Maddox's notes described that Cole hadn't solved yet. A heating problem, so specific, so counterintuitive that when he first read it, he had assumed the corporal was wrong. But the more he thought about it through those cold November evenings, the more he understood that Maddox had identified something that could mean the difference between surviving a normal Nebraska winter and surviving the kind of winter that broke everything else around it. He had the solution in his mind. He had the materials half figured. What he didn't have yet was any way of knowing that he had less time than he thought. Because 200 miles away, the weather system that Walt Gruder's barometer had been quietly tracking all week was no longer moving slowly. It was accelerating. The problem Maddox had written about in those final pages wasn't complicated to understand. It was complicated to accept, because it went against every instinct a person carried about staying warm in a cold place. The corporal had spent his second winter in the Aleutians, watching men build fires that were too large, too hot, and too constant, and he had watched those same men run out of fuel by February, while the winter still had 2 full months left to spend on them. The instinct, when you are cold, is to build the biggest fire you can manage and keep it burning as long as possible. It feels like the right response. It feels like fighting back. But Maddox had written something in the margin of that page in letters slightly larger than the rest, as though he wanted whoever came after him to understand it clearly. He wrote, "The fire is not your friend. The heat is. Learn the difference." Cole had read that line 6 times across the previous week. He thought he understood it, but understanding something on paper and building it with your hands in a frozen field with no money and a wind that had been sharpening itself against the Nebraska plains for 3 straight days were 2 entirely different problems. What Maddox described was a thermal mass system, not a stove in the conventional sense, not a fire you fed and watched and tended through the night, but a structure that absorbed heat during a short, controlled burn and then released it slowly across many hours after the fire was completely out. The principle was old, older than the corporal, older than the military, older than most of the technology surrounding coal in 1951. Certain cultures had understood it for centuries. The idea that stone and dense material could be charged with energy the way a battery was charged, and then trusted to give that energy back gradually while you slept, while you worked, while the temperature outside dropped to places that made iron contract and wood crack. Maddox had built his version from fieldstone and fire clay, packed into a tight mass around a small firebox, with a long flue channel that wound through the body of the structure before reaching the chimney. The channel length was the critical part. It forced hot gases to travel farther before escaping, extracting more heat into the mass with every foot of additional distance. Cole read the dimensions twice, and then looked at what he had available, and started making the necessary adjustments in his head. He couldn't build what Maddox had built, but he could build something that used the same principle. The stone came from the field itself. Nebraska farmland in that part of the county was riddled with sandstone outcroppings just below the surface, and Cole spent the better part of 2 days working a crowbar along the frozen ground to loosen what he needed, loading the pieces onto a salvaged wooden pallet he dragged behind him across the field. His hands, by the end of the first day, were in a condition that would have alarmed anyone who saw them. Cracked across the knuckles, the skin around his nails gone tight and dark from the cold, but he wrapped them each evening in strips of cloth cut from the spare shirt in his canvas bag and went back out the next morning. The fire clay was the harder problem. He couldn't buy it, and he couldn't find it in the field. What he could find, after 2 hours of walking the creek bank east of the Gruder property, was a deposit of heavy gray clay along a bend where the water had undercut the bank. He tested it the way Maddox's notes described, rolling a thin coil between his palms and bending it, and it held without cracking past a certain point. Not perfect, but workable. He carried it back in the empty canvas bag in 3 loads, and by the evening of the 4th day, he had enough material to begin. The construction itself took the better part of a week. Cole worked from Maddox's sketches and his own measurements, building the firebox first from the densest sandstone pieces, then packing the clay mortar between each layer with his fingers, pressing it into every joint until no gap remained. The flue channel came next, a winding path through the body of the mass that extended the smoke's journey by nearly 4 feet before it reached the steel pipe section he had salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding on the far edge of Herb Casson's salvage yard. Every layer had to cure before the next went on, which meant stopping, which meant the kind of patience that felt almost physically painful when the temperature inside the hut at night was still dropping into the low 20s. But Cole had Maddox's warning in his head about rushing the mortar, about the cracking and the smoke failures that came from impatience, and so he stopped when he needed to stop and covered the fresh work with the remaining burlap he had found nailed to the back of the hut's original interior wall. And he waited. On the 6th evening, he lit the first test fire. Small, dry grass and thin kindling, nothing more. He watched the smoke. It moved into the firebox cleanly, disappeared into the channel, and emerged from the pipe in a thin, steady line that bent northeast with the wind and vanished. No backdraft, no spillage. Cole crouched in front of the small opening and held his palm near the stone and felt almost nothing, which was exactly right. The mass was absorbing, not radiating yet. The fire burned for 40 minutes, and then Cole let it die completely. He woke 4 hours later in the dark and pressed his hand flat against the side of the stone mass. What came back through his palm was slow, even, and unmistakable. The stone was warm. Not hot, warm. in the particular steady way of something that had been holding energy patiently and was now quietly returning it to the air around it. The temperature inside the hut that morning was the highest it had been since Cole arrived. He lay on the wooden platform in the pre-dawn dark and stared up at the curved steel ceiling and understood, for the first time with his body rather than just his mind, what Maddox had been writing about in those Aleutian winters a decade earlier. The fire was not the point. The heat was the point. And heat, properly captured and stored, didn't leave when the flames did. It stayed. It worked through the night while you slept. It asked nothing from you at 3 a.m. when the wind was pressing hard against the canvas door and the temperature outside was trying to make decisions about your future. Cole made a single entry in the log that morning, beneath all of Maddox's careful observations. He wrote the indoor temperature, the outdoor temperature, the amount of fuel burned, and the hours elapsed. Then he wrote 4 words beneath the numbers. The system is working. December arrived without ceremony and with considerable seriousness. The temperatures that had been threatening single digits through November finally committed, dropping to 5 above on the first day of the month and continuing downward from there across the following week. Snow came in 2 short waves that left 8 inches on the ground and then crusted over in the cold, creating a surface that caught the light in the mornings like broken glass scattered across the field. Cole's routine had settled into something almost methodical by now. 1 controlled burn each evening, lasting between 60 and 90 minutes, depending on the outdoor temperature, using only dry material, never green wood, never anything that would produce the creosote buildup in the flue channel that Maddox had warned about in emphatic terms. The hut held its heat through each night with enough consistency that Cole had begun reducing the morning fire to a brief warm-up burn rather than a full charge. The wood supply was lasting far longer than he had projected. He was using less than half of what he had originally calculated, which meant something he hadn't dared to think about in those first desperate November days. He might actually have enough to last. But December in Nebraska was not something you assessed in the first week. The plains had a particular cruelty that operated on a longer timeline than most people expected, and the farmers around Harlan County understood it in the way you only understood things you had survived before. Walt Gruder's barometer, which Cole had started checking on his supply walks past the farm, had been behaving strangely for 3 days, not falling steadily, which was the pattern most people watched for, but dropping, recovering slightly, and then dropping again, in a rhythm that the old farmer said he had seen only twice in 40 years of working that land. Cole asked him what it had meant those 2 times. Walt looked out across the field toward the northeast for a long moment before answering. Both times, he said quietly, it had meant something was coming that didn't give you a warning you recognized until it was already too late to finish preparing. Cole walked back to the hut that evening with Walt's words sitting in his chest like a stone. He checked every seal around the door. He checked the flue. He checked the fuel stack and counted what remained. Everything was in order. Everything was as ready as he could make it. What he didn't know yet, what nobody in Harlan County knew yet, was that the 2 families living closest to his field had already made a decision about Cole Brannan that they hadn't told him about yet. And that decision was about to become the most dangerous variable in an equation he thought he had already solved.